My dad called me useless daughter at his retirement party. My $17 million trust said otherwise. It was the kind of thing you see in movies, the perfectly staged tableau of forced smiles and champagne flutes clinking. Except for me, it was real life, a live-action betrayal played out in front of everyone who mattered. The air in the ballroom of the Grandview, a place usually reserved for wedding receptions and corporate galas, hummed with a nervous energy, the kind that precedes a major announcement, or in my case, a public dissection of my worth. Dad, beaming under the spotlights, stood at the podium, a man who had spent his entire adult life building an empire, his empire, and by extension, my future. He just wrapped up a lengthy, self-congratulatory speech about his decades of hard work, the sacrifices, the vision. He'd even managed a few jokes, the kind that landed with polite, practiced chuckles from the assembled crowd of former business partners, his longtime employees, and of course, my own family. My mother, perched at the head table, looked every bit the proud matriarch, her smile a carefully curated mask. My brother, Mark, sat beside her, already looking restless, his gaze darting towards the bar. He'd always been the golden boy, the heir apparent, the one who actually got Dad's business, or at least pretended to. And then he turned his attention to me. He'd called me up onto the small stage, a move so unexpected it made my stomach clench. I'd walked up, trying to project an image of calm, of quiet success, my own law firm a beacon of stability in my life, a testament to my own grit, separate from his. I'd spent years carving out my own path, refusing to be just another appendage of the sterling name. I'd worked tirelessly, pulling all-nighters in my cramped studio apartment, surviving on coffee and sheer determination, while he'd showered Mark with opportunities, internships, seed money for his half-baked ventures. My path had been deliberately solitary, a quiet rebellion against the expected trajectory. I'd wanted to prove something, to myself mostly, that I wasn't just a placeholder waiting for my inheritance. I'd built my own foundation, brick by agonizing brick. Dad put his arm around my shoulders, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of warmth, of connection passed through me. He was still my dad. He'd bought me my first bike, taught me how to tie my shoes, bandaged my scraped knees. But then his voice boomed through the microphone, amplified and distorted, carrying across the hushed room. And now for my daughter, Sarah. Sarah, you've always been a bit of a dreamer, haven't you? A ripple of knowing laughter went through the crowd, the kind that said, "Oh yes, we know Sarah, the sensitive one." My mother's smile faltered for a millisecond. Mark nudged the person next to him, a smirk playing on his lips. "She's got a good heart, bless her," Dad continued, his voice now laced with a patronizing amusement that made my blood run cold. "Always off in her own world, reading those books, writing those essays." He paused, letting the silence hang, then delivered the blow with a theatrical sigh. "Honestly, Sarah, you've always been a bit of a useless daughter." The words landed like physical blows, each syllable a hammer strike against my already fragile composure. Useless daughter. In front of his peers, his employees, his entire family. My carefully constructed facade of composure shattered. My cheeks burned, a searing heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with raw, unadulterated fury. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, pitying, condescending, or worse, indifferent. I could feel the weight of their judgment, the unspoken confirmation of everything I'd feared they all thought about me. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the plush carpet, to scream until my lungs gave out. He then, almost as an afterthought, as if to soften the blow, gestured vaguely towards the side of the stage. "But look, we all have our roles, right? And Sarah, she's got her trust fund, her lovely $17 million trust fund, so I guess she'll be all right." $17 million. The figure hung in the air, a stark, cruel counterpoint to his accusation of uselessness. It was a sum I'd only ever seen on paper, a number that felt abstract, disconnected from my daily reality of billing hours, client consultations, and the constant grind of building a legal career from the ground up. He'd set it up when I was born, a safety net, he'd called it, a way to ensure I'd never have to work if I didn't want to. A gilded cage, I'd always suspected, designed to keep me dependent, to ensure I remained in his orbit, forever his little girl. But I had chosen not to be. I had fought against that destiny, that comfortable obsolescence. And he had just used it, twisted it, to underscore my supposed lack of real contribution, my inherent lack of worth in his eyes. The money, meant to be a symbol of his love, had become a tool of my humiliation. I stood there, frozen, the spotlight blinding me, the laughter echoing in my ears. I could feel my mother's eyes on me, a mixture of apprehension and something akin to disappointment. Mark was openly laughing now, a loud, obnoxious guffaw that cut through the remaining murmur. I managed a tight, forced smile, a grotesque caricature of gratitude. I couldn't speak. My throat was constricted, my thoughts a chaotic jumble of pain and anger. I felt a phantom hand on my back, pushing me gently towards the exit, a silent instruction to leave the stage, to leave the spotlight, to go back to my corner. I mumbled a barely audible "thank you," the words tasting like ash in my mouth, and practically fled the stage, my heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the polished wood. I didn't look back. I walked through the throng of people, each congratulatory pat on the back feeling like a shove, each sympathetic glance a dagger. I found the nearest exit and stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath, the sounds of the party fading behind me. I leaned against the brick wall of the building, the rough texture a welcome anchor in my swirling reality. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent, a torrent of emotions I'd held back for so long. Useless. Me. The one who had always tried so hard to be seen, to be valued for something more than my name or my potential inheritance. The truth was, I knew about the trust. I'd known for years. My father, in his meticulous way, had made sure I understood the terms. It wasn't just a lump sum. It was tied to my father's business, structured in a way that I would only gain full access upon his death, and only if Mark, his chosen successor, was deemed financially stable and responsible. There were clauses, intricate stipulations designed to keep me tethered, dependent on his approval, on Mark's continued success.
He'd always framed it as protection, a way to ensure his legacy was handled responsibly. But looking back, it was control. Absolute, suffocating control. He'd built a fortress around his fortune, and I was on the outside, looking in, perpetually judged. I had spent years trying to be everything he wasn't, trying to be someone he could be proud of, someone who stood on her own 2 feet. I'd poured my energy into my legal career, meticulously building my reputation, taking on challenging cases, fighting for my clients. I'd sacrificed personal relationships, sleep, and weekends. I'd done it all in quiet defiance, in the hope that one day he'd see me, really see me, not just as a daughter, but as a capable, independent woman. I'd wanted him to acknowledge my strength, my resilience, my achievements. But he had never seen it. He'd always seen me through the lens of his own expectations, his own vision of what a daughter should be. And tonight, he had publicly declared me a failure, a pampered rich girl with nothing to offer but a fat trust fund. I sat there for a long time, the cool night air doing little to soothe the burning shame and anger. The sound of my own ragged breathing filled the silence. I thought about the careful planning, the years of strategizing I'd done, not for inheritance, but for independence. I'd quietly amassed my own savings, invested wisely, diversified my assets. I had more than enough to live comfortably, to be financially secure, to never need his money. But that wasn't the point, was it? The point was the validation he refused to give. The point was the poison he'd injected into our family dynamic, the way he'd pitted me against Mark, the way he'd always made me feel less than. I remembered a conversation I'd had with my mother a few years back, after a particularly brutal family dinner, where Dad had subtly undermined a professional achievement of mine. I'd asked her, tears in my eyes, why he always seemed to favor Mark so much, why he never seemed to see my own accomplishments. She'd sighed, her face etched with a weariness I hadn't understood then. "He's a businessman, Sarah," she'd said, her voice soft, almost defeated. "He understands numbers. He understands leverage. He understands how to build something that lasts. He sees Mark as an extension of his empire. You're different. You don't fit into his grand design." At the time, I dismissed it as her trying to protect me, to soften the blow. Now I realized she'd been telling me the unvarnished truth. I was a variable he couldn't control, a wild card in his meticulously calculated game. The $17 million trust. It was more than just money. It was a weapon he wielded, a constant reminder of my perceived dependency, a way to keep me in line, to ensure I never strayed too far from his carefully constructed narrative. He had, in his own twisted way, used it to infantilize me, to diminish my achievements. But I was no longer a child. I was a woman who had been publicly belittled by the man who was supposed to be my biggest supporter. The humiliation was a bitter pill, but beneath it, something hard and sharp began to form. A resolve. A quiet, cold, and unwavering determination. I stood up, brushing imaginary dust off my dress. The shame was still there, a heavy cloak, but it was beginning to feel less like defeat and more like fuel. The tears had stopped. My face was set.
I pulled out my phone, my fingers, usually so adept at navigating legal databases, now trembling slightly as they scrolled through my contacts. I found the name I was looking for, a name I hadn't called in years, a name associated with a world far removed from the polished veneer of my family's success. I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, a strange sense of calm settling over me. The party was still going on inside, the laughter and music a faint hum, but my world had just shifted. The game, it seemed, was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And this time, I would be playing by my own rules. The $17 million trust wasn't a consolation prize for being useless. It was a starting point, a foundation for something entirely different. He thought he'd broken me. He had no idea. He just unleashed me. The chill of the night air seeped into my bones, a stark contrast to the burning humiliation that still simmered beneath my skin. I stood there, leaning against the cold brick of the Grandview, the echoes of my father's words, useless daughter, a venomous mantra in my mind. $17 million. A fortune, he'd said, a comfortable cushion, but he'd used it like a lash, a public declaration of my perceived worthlessness, his subtle way of reminding me that even with all that money, I was still his little girl, dependent and unaccomplished. The smug, pitying smiles of the guests, Mark's obnoxious laughter, it all replayed in my head, each memory a fresh stab. I'd walked away from the stage with my head down, fleeing the spotlight, but somewhere between the ballroom doors and this cold, unforgiving wall, something inside me had shifted. The tears had dried, leaving behind a hollow ache, and then a hard, brittle resolve. My father, Robert Sterling, a titan of industry, a man who measured success in spreadsheets and market shares, had always been a strategist. He'd built his empire with precision, and in his mind, his family was just another branch of his carefully cultivated business. Mark, his son, his heir, was groomed from birth to inherit the Sterling Corporation, a seamless transition built on shared ambition and unquestioning loyalty. I, on the other hand, was the anomaly, the dreamer, the one who dared to forge her own path. He'd set up the trust fund with a paternalistic flourish, a safety net designed, he'd claimed, to ensure my future. But it was more than that. It was a gilded cage, a constant reminder that my true value, in his eyes, was tied to his wealth, not to my own capabilities. I'd spent years fighting that narrative, building my law firm from scratch, sacrificing sleep, relationships, anything to prove my independence, my merit. I'd wanted him to see me as Sarah Sterling Esquire, a formidable legal mind, not just Sarah Sterling, the daughter with the trust fund. But tonight, he'd made it abundantly clear that my achievements, my hard-won independence, meant nothing compared to his carefully constructed image of me. Useless. The word echoed, amplified by the cruel irony of the trust fund. I pulled out my phone, my fingers, usually so steady when navigating complex legal documents, now a little shaky. I scrolled through my contacts, bypassing the familiar names of colleagues and friends, searching for a number I hadn't dialed in years.
It belonged to Arthur Finch, my father's former legal counsel, the architect of the Sterling Empire's intricate legal structure, and more importantly, the trustee of my trust. He was a man of quiet discretion, a shrewd observer of the Sterling family drama, and someone I'd always suspected knew more than he let on. "Arthur," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, a low hum of contained fury beneath the surface. "It's Sarah, Sterling." There was a beat of silence on the other end, a pregnant pause that spoke volumes. "Sarah? A surprise? To what do I owe the pleasure?" His voice was smooth, professional, the kind that could disarm with its politeness. "My father's retirement party," I said, the words clipped. "He just made a rather public statement about me." Another pause. I could almost picture him, sitting in his impeccably organized office, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Ah, Robert, always one for the dramatic flourish." "He called me a useless daughter," I stated, the raw insult still stinging. And then, almost as an afterthought, he pointed to my trust fund, my $17 million trust fund. A low chuckle, devoid of humor. He always did have a way of framing things, didn't he? A true master manipulator of perception. My jaw tightened. Arthur, I know the terms of the trust. I've read them. I know it's structured to keep me dependent, tied to Mark's stability, to my father's approval. I know there are clauses that, well, let's just say they give him a great deal of leverage. Indeed, Arthur replied, his voice becoming more serious. Mr. Sterling was quite thorough in his planning. He valued control, Sarah, above all else. Control, I repeated, the word tasting like bile. And tonight he used that control to humiliate me, publicly. He thinks he's won. He thinks I'm broken. And you are not? He asked, his tone probing but not unkind. I let out a breath, a slow exhale that carried the weight of years of suppressed frustration. No, Arthur, I'm not broken. I'm enlightened. He's given me clarity. He's shown me the game, and I think I'm finally ready to play it. The trust fund was designed as a safety net, Arthur continued, his words carefully chosen, but it was also a testament to his foresight. He wanted to ensure his legacy was protected, that his son would be the sole steward of Sterling Corp. The stipulations regarding your access were, in his words, to prevent any impulsive or detrimental actions that might jeopardize the family's financial standing. He saw you as unpredictable. Unpredictable or just unwilling to fall in line? My voice was sharp. He's always viewed my career as a hobby, a phase, but he was wrong. I've been building something too, Arthur, something he hasn't accounted for. I've noticed, he said, a hint of admiration in his tone. Your firm's reputation has grown considerably. You've handled some rather complex corporate litigation. Impressive, given your age and the resources you started with. I didn't start with Sterling Corporation's backing, I said pointedly. I started with grit and a very detailed understanding of how my father's empire was built, including its vulnerabilities. A significant silence stretched between us. I could feel his attention sharpen, his professional curiosity piqued. Vulnerabilities? He echoed, his voice lower now.
The trust document, I continued, my mind racing, piecing together fragments of conversations, legal jargon I'd once dismissed as irrelevant. It's complex, and I remember my father mentioning contingencies, provisions for unforeseen circumstances, especially concerning Mark's ability to manage the corporation should he ever falter. Mr. Sterling anticipated many eventualities, Arthur said slowly. He was a man who always hedged his bets. He also set up the trust to be managed by a single trustee, correct? I pressed. You. That is correct. And the beneficiaries, Mark and myself. But the primary beneficiary, in terms of control over the assets, was always intended to be Sterling Corporation, managed by Mark, as long as he met certain performance metrics and maintained a certain level of financial solvency. If he failed to meet those metrics, or if Sterling Corp faced significant financial distress, that's where it gets interesting, isn't it? Arthur remained silent, but the quiet hum on the line felt different now. It was the sound of a chess player considering a pivotal move. My father believed Mark was infallible, I went on, my voice gaining a dangerous edge. He'd groomed him, protected him, shielded him from the harsh realities of business. He never let Mark truly fail. He never let him face the consequences of his own mistakes. Mark has always been enthusiastic, Arthur offered diplomatically. Enthusiastic is one word for it. Reckless is another. And he's been making some very expensive, very risky decisions lately. Decisions my father would have vetted, questioned, perhaps even shut down. But my father's out of the picture now, isn't he? And Mark is left holding the reins, with no one to rein him in. I'd heard whispers, rumors from disgruntled former employees, hushed conversations at industry events. Mark's ventures, supposedly diversifying Sterling Corp's portfolio, were hemorrhaging money. Investments in speculative tech startups, ill-advised real estate deals, ventures that reeked of vanity and poor judgment, not sound business strategy. My father, in his arrogance, had never envisioned his precious son capable of squandering his empire. He'd focused on controlling me, the perceived threat, never anticipating the threat from within his own chosen successor. Arthur, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, you have access to all of Sterling Corp's financial statements. You have oversight. You know what Mark has been doing. I am privy to a great deal of information, Sarah, he replied, his voice carefully neutral. And I believe you have a fiduciary duty to ensure the beneficiaries are protected and that the trust's stipulations are upheld. If Sterling Corp is in financial jeopardy, if Mark is mismanaging its assets, that triggers certain clauses, doesn't it?
clauses that could give you, as trustee, the power to intervene, to take control. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of a dam beginning to crack. Arthur Finch, the stoic, impartial trustee, the keeper of my father's secrets, was contemplating a seismic shift in the Sterling dynasty. Your father was very specific about the conditions for trustee intervention, Arthur said, his voice strained. It requires irrefutable evidence of financial mismanagement that poses a substantial threat to the value of the trust's assets, a threat that could render your own access moot.
Irrefutable evidence, I repeated, a slow smile spreading across my face. I have friends in high places, Arthur, people who deal in financial forensics, people who can uncover the kind of rot that Mark has been burying, and I'm willing to pay them handsomely for their diligence. Their diligence in finding exactly the kind of evidence you'd need to act. The implication hung heavy in the air. I wasn't just seeking retribution for my father's public humiliation, I was orchestrating a corporate coup. The trust fund, my father's instrument of control, was about to become the lever with which I'd dismantle his carefully constructed empire. He'd called me useless, dependent on his money. He had no idea I'd already been working on my own counter-strategy, leveraging my legal acumen and a network of contacts he'd never even known existed. You are proposing a coordinated effort, Arthur stated, a note of unease in his voice. I'm proposing the truth, Arthur, the unvarnished, ugly truth about what Mark is doing to my father's legacy, a legacy you are sworn to protect, a legacy that includes me, whether my father liked it or not. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. He wanted me to be a dreamer. Well, I'm dreaming up a future for Sterling Corp, a future without Mark at the helm, a future where I have a say, a future where I am anything but useless. This is a significant undertaking, Sarah, Arthur cautioned. The legal ramifications are complex. The potential for fallout is immense. I'm a lawyer, Arthur. I understand risk, and I understand consequences. My father taught me that. He just never expected me to apply those lessons to him or to his precious son. I took a deep breath, the cold air invigorating. So, the question is, Arthur, are you going to stand by and watch Sterling Corp crumble under Mark's incompetence, or are you going to help me salvage my father's legacy? The legacy that, ironically, my father's own planning has now put me in a position to claim. The call ended with a promise from Arthur to review certain documents, to consider the implications. It was a small victory, but it was a start, a crack in the monolithic facade of Sterling Corp. I hung up, my heart pounding, a strange mix of exhilaration and cold dread washing over me. The humiliation I'd felt on that stage was being replaced by a fierce, unyielding drive. I hailed a cab, the city lights blurring past my window. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of legal strategy, financial data, and a deep-seated rage that had been building for years. I had to go to my father's office. Not to gloat, not to confront him directly. He wasn't the type to be reasoned with when his ego was involved. But I needed to see it, to feel the space where he'd exerted his power for so long. I needed to walk through the halls where I'd always felt like an outsider and envision them as mine. The Sterling Corporation building was a monument to my father's ambition, a sleek glass tower that pierced the downtown skyline. The security guard at the front desk gave me a polite, if slightly surprised, nod. He knew who I was, of course, but my visits were rare, usually reserved for family events or mandated meetings. Tonight, I wasn't an invited guest. I was a predator entering her territory. I took the elevator to the executive floor, the smooth ascent a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence I was experiencing. The reception area was hushed, opulent, a testament to my father's meticulous attention to detail. A young assistant, unfamiliar to me, looked up from her pristine desk, her eyes widening slightly. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. "I'm Sarah Sterling," I said, my voice calm and authoritative. "I need to see my father's office." She hesitated, clearly unsure of my standing. "Mr. Sterling he's not in the office at the moment. He's enjoying his retirement." "I'm aware," I replied, my gaze sweeping across the room, absorbing the details. "But I need to access his private files. I'm handling certain matters related to his trust." Her apprehension deepened. "I'm not sure I can grant access without authorization." "My father placed his trust in Arthur Finch," I said, a deliberate misdirection. And Arthur Finch has informed me that certain documents require my immediate attention. I'm sure you don't want to be the reason for any delay, do you?" She faltered, the weight of my pronouncement, coupled with the implied authority of Arthur's name, clearly unsettling her. After a moment's internal debate, she gestured towards a heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. "It's through there. I'll have to inform security, of course." "That would be appreciated," I said, a faint smile playing on my lips. As I walked towards the office, the hushed atmosphere of the executive floor felt charged with unspoken secrets. The assistant followed at a respectful distance, her movements betraying her anxiety. The oak door swung open, revealing the heart of my father's kingdom. The office was exactly as I remembered it, if not more so. Massive mahogany desk, plush leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The air still held the faint scent of my father's expensive cologne, a phantom presence that clung to the expensive furnishings. It was a space designed to inspire awe, to project power, a space where I had always felt small, insignificant. "You can wait out here," I said to the assistant, my voice firm. She nodded gratefully and retreated, leaving me alone in the echoing silence. I walked over to the desk, my fingers tracing the polished surface. This was where he'd made the decisions that shaped my life, where he dictated my worth. I ran my hand over the leather-bound ledger that sat on the corner of his desk. It was his personal record, a meticulously kept log of his daily activities, meetings, and thoughts. He'd always believed in documenting everything. I opened it, my heart thudding against my ribs. The pages were filled with his precise, spidery handwriting. Dates, times, names, brief notations. And then I saw it, a series of entries from the last few months, detailing meetings with investment bankers, lawyers, and even private investigators. The names were familiar, the subject matter vaguely troubling. He'd been anticipating Mark's eventual downfall. He hadn't just trusted Mark, he'd been hedging his bets against him, just as Arthur had implied. Digging deeper, I found cryptic references to Project Nightingale. It sounded like a code name, something clandestine. He'd been investigating Mark's business dealings, uncovering evidence of serious financial impropriety, and he'd been working with external parties to build a case, a legal strategy to potentially oust Mark from his position should it become necessary. He hadn't told me, of course.
He hadn't wanted me to be the one to bring down his precious son. He'd wanted to maintain control, to orchestrate the downfall himself on his own terms. But the most damning entry wasn't about Mark. It was dated just a week before his retirement party, a meeting with his personal lawyer. The notation read, "Finalizing revised trust amendments, clarifying distribution of residual assets upon successful divestment of Sterling Corp. Sarah's portion to be reevaluated pending outcome of Mark's performance review." Re-evaluated, pending outcome of Mark's performance review. The implication was clear and chilling. He had been actively planning to alter my trust, to potentially reduce my inheritance, based on Mark's performance. The very man he'd called useless was now subject to the whims of his golden boy. It was a profound betrayal, a final, devastating blow from beyond the grave, or in this case, from the brink of retirement. He hadn't just underestimated me, he'd been actively plotting against me. Suddenly, the whispers of Mark's reckless investments took on a terrifying new dimension. If Sterling Corp was on the verge of collapse, if Mark was actively squandering the company's assets, then my father's Project Nightingale would have been a desperate attempt to salvage what he could, and my own trust fund, that symbol of his paternalistic control, was now a pawn in his final, desperate game. I sat there, the ledger open before me, the city lights blurring through my tear-filled eyes. The humiliation of the party, the sting of his words, the calculated cruelty of his actions, it all coalesced into a single overwhelming emotion, cold, hard fury. He had underestimated me in the most profound way. He'd seen me as a dreamer, easily dismissed. He'd never imagined I would dig, that I would uncover his secrets, that I would use his own meticulous planning against him. I closed the ledger, the snap of the cover echoing in the silent office. The $17 million trust fund wasn't just a safety net. It was a weapon. And my father, in his final act of control, had inadvertently given me the ammunition. He'd been so focused on protecting his legacy from my perceived recklessness, he'd failed to see the true threat, his own son. And now I would be the one to ensure his legacy survived, not through blind loyalty to a failing heir, but through decisive, calculated action. The game had indeed changed, and I was no longer just a player.
I was about to become the architect of its endgame. The silence of the office no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a prelude to something seismic. I stood up, my gaze fixed on the city skyline, the weight of my father's secrets heavy in my hands. This was just the beginning. The air in the office was thick with the ghosts of my father's decisions, each polished surface reflecting a history I now understood with chilling clarity. He hadn't just gifted me money. He'd built a cage with gilded bars, and he'd meticulously documented every step of his plan. Project Nightingale, his secret investigation into Mark's financial freefall, was a desperate attempt to control the inevitable. But his last ledger entry, that final amendment to the trust, was his ultimate miscalculation. He thought he was protecting his legacy by potentially clawing back my inheritance if Mark failed. He never imagined I'd be the one to ensure Mark did fail, thereby securing my claim, and then some.
I walked out of the Sterling Corporation building, the night air biting at my cheeks, but a fire had ignited within me. The sting of humiliation was a distant memory, replaced by a potent, focused resolve. The next morning, I didn't go to my law firm. Instead, I headed straight to Arthur Finch's impeccably sterile office downtown. The usual pleasantries felt hollow, a facade I no longer needed to maintain. "Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet professionalism of his office. "The ledger, my father's personal ledger, specifically the entry regarding amendments to my trust fund, dated the week before his retirement party." Arthur Finch, a man who usually navigated conversations with the grace of a seasoned diplomat, stiffened. His eyes, always sharp and observant, narrowed slightly. He knew I'd found it. He knew I knew. "Mr. Sterling kept extensive records," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "He did," I agreed, leaning forward. "And he was clearly preparing to divest Sterling Corp. He was building a case against Mark, preparing for the worst, and in doing so, he inadvertently created the very conditions that would solidify my position as a beneficiary, not just a ward." Arthur picked up a heavy crystal paperweight, turning it slowly in his hands. "The trust stipulated that if Sterling Corp faced significant financial distress, or if Mark's management jeopardized the trust's assets, I, as trustee, had the authority to intervene, to protect the principal." "Exactly," I confirmed, my voice low and steady. "And my father's private notes, his Project Nightingale, confirmed that he knew Mark was jeopardizing the assets. He knew Sterling Corp was in distress. He was gathering evidence for a legal battle he intended to wage himself. He was preparing for Mark's failure." "He was attempting to mitigate potential losses," Arthur corrected, his voice taut. "He was attempting to control the narrative, Arthur, and he failed. He failed because he never accounted for me seeing this for what it truly is, not a retirement, but a strategic retreat before the storm. He was looking for ways to secure his legacy, and in doing so, he created the ultimate failsafe for me." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "That amendment, the one that said my portion would be reevaluated pending outcome of Mark's performance review, it's irrelevant now, because my father's own investigation confirmed Mark's performance was the outcome. The distress was confirmed, the jeopardy was confirmed, by his own hand." Arthur finally met my gaze, his usual impassive expression replaced by a flicker of something akin to respect. "You've interpreted the stipulations aggressively, Sarah." "I've interpreted them literally, Arthur. My father's own notes provide irrefutable evidence of Sterling Corp's financial instability under Mark's management before my father's retirement. He knew it was a sinking ship. He was just trying to decide who to bail out first." I leaned back, a chilling calm settling over me. "And he was going to penalize me for Mark's mismanagement. He was going to use Mark's failure against me. Well, turns out, Mark's failure is my golden ticket." The ensuing weeks were a blur of legal filings, financial audits, and calculated maneuvering. I enlisted the help of the same forensic accountants my father had reportedly used for Project Nightingale, but I leveraged their findings to my advantage. They unearthed the full extent of Mark's reckless spending, the failed tech startups, the speculative real estate gambles that had bled Sterling Corp dry, the lavish personal expenditures disguised as business expenses. It was a financial crime scene, and Mark was the perpetrator. Arthur Finch, bound by his fiduciary duty and armed with the undeniable evidence I provided, had no choice but to act. The trust's clauses were clear. He initiated a formal review of Sterling Corporation's financial health, citing gross mismanagement and a significant threat to the trust's principal assets. The legal machinery, set in motion by my father's own foresight, now worked against his chosen heir. The Sterling family dinner, usually a weekly ritual of forced pleasantries and thinly veiled judgments, became my battleground. My mother, bless her oblivious heart, had been thrilled with my father's retirement, convinced it meant more relaxed family gatherings. Mark, radiating an air of unearned confidence, was already acting like the undisputed king of Sterling Corp. I'd arrived late, as always, the weight of the impending reckoning settling on my shoulders. The usual chatter about stock prices and expansion plans filled the air. My mother was beaming, oblivious to the storm gathering on the horizon. Mark was holding court, recounting exaggerated tales of his business acumen. My father, retired and ostensibly enjoying his freedom, sat at the head of the table, a smug satisfaction etched on his face, convinced he'd orchestrated a perfect handover. He'd called me useless. He'd set up my trust fund as a gilded cage. He'd never imagined I'd break out and tear down the whole damn prison. So, Mark began, swirling his wineglass, his gaze meeting mine with a condescending smirk. Heard you've been busy with your little law firm, Sarah. Still playing dress-up in your power suits? My mother shot him a warning glance, but my father just chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Mark, don't antagonize your sister. She's got her trust fund she's taking care of. The words, intended as a dismissive jab, landed like a thunderclap. I smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of my lips. Actually, Father, that's precisely what I wanted to discuss, about the trust fund and Sterling Corporation. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Mark's smirk faded, replaced by a frown of confusion. My father's eyes narrowed, his complacency evaporating. My mother's smile faltered. What about it? Mark scoffed. Is it not enough for your designer shoes? It's more than enough, Mark, I said, my voice calm, almost serene. It's become the instrument of your termination. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Mark stared at me, his face draining of color. My father's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. What are you talking about? My father finally managed, his voice a strained whisper. I'm talking about the fact that Sterling Corporation is on the verge of collapse, I stated, my gaze sweeping over each of them, and that your own investigation, Father, documented every single one of Mark's catastrophic decisions. Project Nightingale, wasn't it? Quite the thorough job. You knew Mark was bleeding the company dry. My father's face contorted with a mixture of shock and fury. That was a private matter, a contingency.
A contingency that confirms Mark's incompetence, I pressed on, my voice gaining an edge of steel. And according to the terms of my trust, Arthur Finch, as trustee, has the power to intervene in cases of financial distress and gross mismanagement, which, as you both know, is precisely the situation Sterling Corporation is in. Mark lunged forward, his face a mask of outrage. You're lying. You're trying to frame me. Am I? I countered, my eyes locking with his. Or am I simply presenting the irrefutable financial records that my father himself had compiled? The records that show you've squandered millions on speculative ventures, that you've taken Sterling Corp to the brink of bankruptcy. Records that prove you are no longer fit to manage this company. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was trembling, not with fear, but with a rage that threatened to consume him. You can't do this. You're a lawyer. You know the law. You can't just dismantle everything I've built. I'm not dismantling it, Father, I said, my voice softening, a hint of genuine regret creeping in. I'm salvaging it. You want it to protect your legacy. You just chose the wrong heir, and you underestimated the value of your useless daughter, because I have the evidence. I have the legal standing, and thanks to your meticulous planning, I have the trustees' full cooperation. Arthur Finch, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward. He held a thick folder in his hand. Robert, he said, his voice grave, Sarah is correct. The evidence of severe financial mismanagement is overwhelming. Sterling Corporation is in a precarious position. As trustee, and under the stipulations of the trust agreement, I have been compelled to take immediate action to protect the assets. This includes initiating the process of removing Mark Sterling as CEO and assuming temporary control of the corporation's finances until a viable management solution can be found. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. My mother let out a choked sob. Mark stood frozen, his face a ghastly white, his world imploding around him. My father, the titan, the strategist, the man who believed he controlled everything, looked utterly defeated. The smug satisfaction was gone, replaced by a dawning horror.
He had orchestrated his own downfall, using his own daughter as the unwitting instrument of his demise. Temporary control? My father choked out, his voice cracking. What does that even mean? Arthur Finch's gaze was steady, unwavering. It means Sterling Corporation's future and the management of its assets will no longer be in Mark's hands. It means a thorough restructuring. And it means that the trust stipulations regarding Sarah's beneficiary status, especially in light of the confirmed financial distress and the amendments you yourself were preparing, Robert, are now irrevocably in her favor. Her claim as a primary beneficiary with a vested interest in the trust preservation is now paramount. The air crackled with the unspoken truth. My father hadn't just failed to control me, he'd inadvertently empowered me. The trust fund, his ultimate tool of subjugation, had become my weapon. The $17 million, that symbol of his condescension, was no longer a gilded cage, but the key to unlocking his entire empire. Mark finally broke, a guttural roar of despair erupting from him.
He lunged towards Arthur, but security guards, alerted beforehand, swiftly moved to restrain him. My mother, weeping uncontrollably, sank into a chair. My father stood, a broken man, his empire crumbling around him, brought down not by a rival corporation, but by his own daughter, the one he had dismissed as useless. I watched the scene unfold, a profound sense of quiet victory washing over me. There was no triumph, no gloating, just a deep, abiding sense of justice, served cold and with brutal efficiency. My father's last act of control had been to document his son's failure, and in doing so, he had written the script for my ascension. I hadn't sought this. I hadn't wanted this destructive path. But he had pushed me, he had humiliated me, and he had underestimated me to the bitter end. The silence that followed was the most eloquent testament to my victory. The shattered remnants of the Sterling family, the crumbling facade of a corporate empire, all stood as proof. I hadn't just survived my father's control, I had shattered it. And in its place, I had built something far more substantial. Not just wealth, but agency. Not just power, but vindication. I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving them to the wreckage of their own making. The night air outside felt crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating drama I just witnessed. The city lights twinkled, no longer symbols of my father's dominance, but promises of a future I would now shape on my own terms. The weight on my shoulders had lifted, replaced by a quiet, unshakable strength. This was not an ending. It was the beginning of everything.